This morning we're going to start oddly. We're going to start by looking at a series of pictures from a wordless children's book. So let's begin. Talk you through them. First one's just blank. I don't know if you're getting that. Is that coming through? There we go. Okay. So what is this? It could be an abstraction, an abstract painting. Maybe it's a crown, top of a crown, a star. We'll go to the next one. And we zoom out. When we do, we see that it is a very strange-looking rooster. We zoom out again. Aw, how cute. Little children looking at a rooster through a window. Okay, next. They're in a lovely room, somewhere in the Netherlands, it seems. We'll pull back again. Or not. Okay, you can see, oh yes, good. You can see now that we're part of a farm with a lot of outbuildings and a truck driven by Grandpa, who is a moonshiner, as you can tell from the erratic driving behavior. Okay, again. Hold on. Plot twist. These are toys. Okay, back again. Evidently not very interesting toys. Look at the look on that child's face. Why are you making me pose with this toy I hate? That's what that face says. Pull back again. Hold on. Another plot twist. And back again. It turns out the boredom is multi-layered. Pull back again. This is the front of a catalog that can't keep this boy awake as he sits back again. Poolside, back again. On a cruise ship, back again. Cruise ship in the middle. Wait a minute, what's the ing? What's that upper left ing? Pull back again. This is just an advertisement for a cruise line. Pull back again. On a bus. Pull back again. A bus in the middle of a city. But hold on. What's this thing in the foreground? It looks like a surfboard, perhaps. Pull back again. This is a man sitting in the middle of a desert watching television. And one last pullback. It's Arizona. That's what catches your eye until you look at the border and you realize this is just a postage stamp. And at this point in the book, so I think the next slide is just black. Is that right? Great. Okay, so at this point in the book, the logic changes. So I stopped the pictures. The logic changes because we see that the letter is being delivered in a South Pacific island somewhere, and then the camera just pulls, well, the illustrator just pulls back out into outer space until you see a globe at first and it's pretty, and then you keep pulling back, and the Earth becomes nothing but a tiny little white dot surrounded by utter emptiness and darkness. It's a strange book, and I'm not sure it's appropriate for children, actually, because the farther you zoom out, the more meaningless everything is. It starts, aw, so cute. But then you zoom out through multiple levels of bored children, only to think at the end, what's even the point of existence? I'm not sure this is what we want for our children. But I'm showing it to you because it's the zoom out that I think is important, and we're going to do something like a zoom out in the sermon this morning. And also, I'm hoping that our zoom out ends with more meaning, not less. So, we are in the midst of a mini-series on the law and the prophets. A very, very interesting topic. Last week we focused on what the law did for the ancient Israelites, how the law was a gift to them. They had just escaped from Egypt, where they had been drowning in Egyptian culture. They were now standing around milling about the base of Mount Sinai, and they were headed for Canaan, where they were about to be surrounded by even more ancient Near Eastern cultures, and they were vulnerable. That's what we saw last week. And the law protected them from unhealthy worldviews. The law turned these wandering individuals into a people, to a family. And understood properly, the restrictions of the law, ironically, the restrictions set them free. Free from the anxiety of Egyptian culture, free from those other Canaanite cultures that would threaten to lead them away from what we sometimes just call shalom, the idea that we're flourishing, that all of our relationships are healthy. This morning, as we continue to look at the law, we're going to have our own zoom out, like with the book, but unlike with that book, hopefully not a zoom out into meaninglessness, but into a grand scheme that is beautiful. So here's the short version of the sermon. If you feel like you can't make it to the end, if you can just make it to the end of this paragraph, you'll get it. The law did not just show up out of nowhere. When Moses came down from the top of Mount Sinai, he did not bring just a list of rules. He brought rules, yes, but they were part of something bigger, something even more basic that they would have understood, and that was an invitation from God into a particular kind of relationship. The most important thing Moses brought down from the mountaintop was not the laws, but the offer of a covenant from God. And the law was just one part of that covenant. So when we zoom out, we see it's not just law, it's covenant. And when we zoom out even more, we see that the Old Testament covenant is just one part of the overall biblical drama, which is beautiful. There, that's the short version. The rest of the sermon is the long version. The law, to repeat, did not show up as a random list of rules. The Israelites never thought of those rules on their own. The laws were always talked about and thought about in the context of something bigger. And that something bigger was the covenant. Now for us today, the lesson is this. If we're going to take an exegetical approach, if we're going to look at the law and try to think about it the way the ancient Israelites thought about it so we can learn something from them, then we too have to understand how the law fits into the larger category of covenant. So the first obvious question is, what's a covenant? And a better version of that question is, what was a covenant to them, to ancient Israelites living as they did in the ancient Near East? So let's start with that. Here's your textbook definition. A covenant was a type of ancient Near Eastern social contract. A social contract, a social understanding. Now, what's interesting for us, I think, is that this kind of covenant predates the Old Testament. It was around. It was in the air. So when God reached out to the Israelites and said, essentially, I want to make a covenant with you, they didn't hear this like we do. I want to make a with you. That's how we understand the word covenant. Not very well. They knew what God was talking about. It was common. It was a common thing in the ancient Near East. God was referring to a social practice that was already all around them in the air, culturally. So what was it? What did they know that we don't know? So the covenant God made with the Israelites was the kind of agreement, social agreement, that was usually made between a conquering king and a conquered group of people, or an overlord and underlings, if you want to think of it that way. It was a binding contract on both sides, and it brought benefits to both parties. The king promised the people he'd provide security and protection so long as they showed him loyalty. And loyalty usually just meant doing things like paying taxes and providing a workforce when the king needed more soldiers or more handmaidens. The king benefited, obviously, by receiving the taxes and men for his army and women as servants. And the servant group benefited because they were protected and cared for in times of need. If they were attacked by an outside enemy or if they experienced famine, the king would protect them. So both sides benefit. Okay. This typical ancient Near Eastern covenant or social contract had 6 parts to it, and I'm going to put them up on the screen here. So the first part. The parties that were involved were named. It didn't have to be long, just listed the name of the king and the name of the people group that were underneath the king now. Second, there was a brief history given as to how they met. You people experienced a famine, and I, a neighboring king, came to your rescue, so now we have this agreement. The third thing was, in this covenant, all the rules that had to be followed. The laws. How to show loyalty. Or in the case of the ancient Israelites, what we've just come to call the law. This is where the taxes and things like that would be listed. Fourth, there were witnesses that were listed as witnesses to this agreement. By the way, we still do this with our contracts. You still have to witness a lot of contracts. And these witnesses would be people, yes, but very often things like mountains and the gods and other very, very long-lasting things to symbolize that this was to be a very, very long-lasting covenant. The fifth thing, they described the consequences if you followed the rules and consequences if you did not. Blessings, this shouldn't be a plot twist here, blessings if you obeyed and curses if you did not. And sixth, there were instructions to meet regularly and hear the covenant read aloud so that everybody involved got a regular review, a regular reminder. This doesn't seem all that shocking that this would be in a social contract. In fact, there's a word we have that some of us here have the blessing/curse of being in what is literally a death pledge, if you look at the word, but we don't usually say death pledge, we usually say mortgage. It just seems a bit more uplifting to say mortgage. But a mortgage has all of these elements except for the story part, the brief history. We were driving down the street and we saw the sign being put in the front yard. And other than that, all these things are in a mortgage. And other kinds of contracts we're familiar with. So it's not that far-fetched, this idea of an ancient Near Eastern contract. But in an ancient Near Eastern sort of contract, in the language, you will, all throughout these 6 sections, you would hear, I will be your king and you will be my people. Or I will be your Lord and you will be my people. That would be repeated. And I wonder if that sounds familiar to you. I will be your God and you will be my people. It sounds familiar because all through the Old Testament, it's just filled with covenant talk, with legalese, with jargon from ancient Near Eastern covenant. And I want to give you some examples from the Bible, section by section. So, good, they're still up there. The first 2, naming the parties and giving a brief history. It can be really brief. And all through the Old Testament, you'll find things like this. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. And that's sections 1 and 2 up there. The laws, of course, we've talked about. They're all through the Old Testament. The fourth thing up there, naming witnesses. God says, I call the heavens and the earth as witnesses this day, when he talks to the Israelites. And I'm going to dwell for a while on the blessings and the curses. All through, especially the first 5 books of the Old Testament, the Israelites are told very clearly what will happen if you do obey and what will happen if you don't. And this was always done in a covenant, whether it was with the Israelites or not, all through the ancient Near East. So here's an example of a blessing. If you follow my decrees and are careful to obey my commands, I will send you rain in its season, and the ground will yield its crops, and the tree their fruit. Your threshing, I love this, your threshing will continue until grape harvest, and your grape harvest will continue until planting, and you will eat all the food you want. I will grant peace in the land, and you will lie down while no one makes you afraid. That's the blessing. But if you will not listen to me, If you will not carry out all these commands, and if you reject my decrees and abhor my laws and fail to carry out my commands, and therefore violate my covenant, then I will bring upon you. It's not often you get to say this in a sermon. Sudden terror, wasting diseases, and fever that will destroy your sight and sap your strength. You will plant seed in vain because your enemies will eat it. The blessings that sound beautiful to us. I saw some of you close your eyes and rest in them. The curses sound awful. But it's kind of helpful to know that curses like this were pretty standard in ancient Near Eastern covenants back then. They're called futility curses. And they often are in the shape of things like, you will plant, but you will not reap. You will lie down, but you will not sleep. It was just the legalese. If you wanted to draw up an ancient Near Eastern social contract like this, it was just normal. And so I think it wouldn't have been as scarring for them as it is for us, because they would have expected it as part of the form. A little bit like if you go to a wedding that follows a more old-fashioned liturgy, when they call for anyone to call out objections to these people getting married. It's just a form. We're not really on edge at that moment. And if you just popped into a wedding ceremony like that, you'd think, this is rude. These people want to get married. Just let them be married. But it's just a form. And the final thing, the regular review. We read this in one part of Deuteronomy. These commandments that I give you today. Actually, Pamela read a paraphrase of this morning. These commands that I give you today are to be on your hearts. Impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road, when you lie down, when you get up. Tie them as symbols on your hands. Bind them to your foreheads. Write them on the door frames of your houses and your gates. In other words, regular review, which is what the sixth part of a covenant always calls for. And in this case, regular review for common people in the rhythm of their everyday lives. But interestingly, it wasn't just the common people who were called to this. There were also instructions for kings when it came to regular review. Listen to this. When a king takes the throne of his kingdom, he is to write for himself on a scroll a copy of this law. You want to be king? You've got an assignment, a writing assignment. Write out the entire law. It is to be with him, and he is to read it all the days of his life so that he may learn to revere the Lord his God and follow carefully all the words of this law and these decrees, and to echo all sorts of prosecutors south of the border, not consider himself better than his fellow Israelites. No one is above the law. There was even an instruction for everyone in Israel to get together once every 7 years. Assemble the people, we read, men, women, and children, and the foreigners residing in your towns, so they can all listen and learn to obey the Lord your God and follow carefully all the words of this law. So there you have it. What I'm trying to say is there's covenant talk everywhere in the Old Testament. And once we know that these 6 things were part of a known legal form, it helps us to understand what's going on. Sometimes there are long sections in the Old Testament covering multiple chapters and even across books that follow this 6-part structure, just so you know. And one last passage I want to read to you that blends many elements up here. This day I call the heavens and the earth as witnesses that I have set before you life and death, blessings and curses. Now choose life, so that you and your children may live, so that you may love the Lord your God, listen to God's voice, and hold fast to God. For the Lord is your life and will give you many years in the land the Lord swore to give your fathers Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That one paragraph covers many of these facets here. Again, it's covenant talk. Now, in my next sermon, which is not next week, but in my next sermon, I'm going to detail what a lot of this can teach us about God, But for now, just two quick observations before we continue to zoom out and have an even bigger picture. So we can just go to the black slide, which is next. The first observation I want to make is, once again, the rules don't show up on their own. The rules arrive in the context of a relationship. And this sort of thing ought to be familiar to us, because in our own homes, we, each one of us, have unique rules that grow out of our relationships there. I want to give you an example from my home. Here's an example from the Teel household. And I'm going to try to word it like Leviticus might word it. No one who carries the seed of the Ericus hypogea may enter the home. Neither anyone carrying food made with the seeds, nor anything that has come in contact with them. All who have touched these seeds shall be declared unclean and must wash thoroughly with soap and water. Then they shall be pronounced clean. Or to put that another way, do not bring peanuts into our house. Why do we have that rule? Because we have a daughter with a severe allergy whose life is threatened by peanuts. We want her to thrive because she's our daughter, and we, it turns out, have an irrational, completely irrational love for her. So leave your peanut butter cookies at home. Thank you very much. And I want you to notice in that example, which is just one, and we all have them, that the relationship comes first. She is our daughter. We are deeply interested in her well-being. We care more about the richness of her life than the variety of our diet. So we have rules, but the rules serve the relationship. They're to keep the relationship alive and well. And I just want to point out that in covenant speak, it's the same, even though it doesn't look like it from such a distance. In the Old Testament, the rules are secondary. The relationship, the covenant, is the main thing. It's primary. And that relationship comes to the Israelites in the form of something they already recognized, an ancient Near Eastern covenant. That's my first observation. My second one, before we zoom out some more, in any other ancient Near Eastern covenant that is like this, the benefits come to both servant people and the conquering king. But the Israelite covenant seems weird that way. It seems at first only to benefit the people. Even though the covenant is God's idea, God's initiative, but honestly, what does God get out of this relationship? Other than heartache and frustration. I'm so tired of this stubborn and stiff-necked people. And the Old Testament makes it very clear that God has no need for any physical stuff. God keeps saying that. And yeah, there are laws about bringing money to the temple and sacrifices to the temple and about maintaining the priesthood and keeping the temple functioning, and it seems like that might be a benefit for God, but actually God makes it perfectly clear that God is in no need of anything people can bring. And makes it absolutely clear that God would rather have the people obey the spirit of the law by taking care of the poor and the needy and the vulnerable, as we sang. God would rather that than all the perfect sacrifices anyone could bring to the temple. To obey is better than sacrifice, we hear repeatedly. So the question is, what's the benefit for God in this Israelite covenant? Why initiate this? And the answer, upon reflection, at least to me, seems to be that God benefits because God delights when human beings can live good, rich lives in societies marked by freedom, in societies in which everyone can flourish. In other words, perhaps we can put it this way: God is irrationally in love with us, and we are God's children. The covenant is there just so we can have life and have it abundantly. And if you recall from last week what the normal ancient Near Eastern gods were like, totally self-centered, This is a stunning contrast. A covenant that is not God-focused, but people-focused. Again, there will be more details coming, but this morning we just have one more big zoom out to go. And we're going to pull back and look at the whole Bible all at once. That's all. Now, there have been all sorts of attempts at describing the entire story that's told by the Bible. Sometimes in my high school classes, when I do teach a Bible class, I'll say, okay, everybody take out a piece of paper. I want you to write down the story of the Bible. I'll give you about 5 minutes. And you just see the panic. And some people can just say, God created stuff and it's going to be nice one day. Okay, that's a good high-level view. Some people, though, they cannot help themselves. They get drawn down into the... And then Cain said a bad thing, and then they're lost. There's no chance. But one fairly common way of thinking about the overall story of the Bible, and that overall story is sometimes called the biblical meta-narrative. Meta-narrative means story of stories. Sometimes it's called the biblical drama or just overall story. One fairly common way of approaching this is to think of the Bible as a 6-act play. Okay, a play on a stage with 6 acts. So the curtains come up on Act 1. And Act 1 is creation. And in this first act, God does something totally unnecessary. And that is create a world. Out of a sense of delight. Not out of a sense of obligation. It wasn't an accident. We have God, the artist, and creation as art. We talked about this at our church retreat. And then Act 2. I'm calling this the complication rather than the fall, thus cleverly avoiding a theological debate that would distract us from the inconvenient truth that I want to focus on. And the inconvenient truth is this: love requires freedom. If somebody says they love me because they were hypnotized to, that doesn't feel like love. If somebody says they love me because they just had no choice, it was a reflex, it doesn't feel like love. What makes love powerful is that there's a freedom, and the love is given freely. Love requires freedom, but freedom brings with it complication. If you've had the privilege to watch someone's baby grow into your child, you have seen for yourself that in human development, the ability to love and the ability to sin show up at the same time. And the same thing happened for humanity itself. And so in Act 2, there is an acknowledgement of this complication. A world with love in it is a world with freedom in it, and a world with freedom in it is a world that's messy. So in the biblical drama, the question becomes, what is God going to do about this? And that brings us to Act 3, the covenant that God makes with Israel. This is what God's going to do about it. Not, notice, push a magic button and make it all go away. No, instead it's build a relationship. Initiate a covenant with an obscure people group, telling them the whole time that the plan is to bring delight and good news to the whole world. Why do this? To reset the relationship between humanity and God in a way that never violates human freedom. It's complicated, this act, and slow going, and long, and not always appropriate for children. But eventually, toward the end of Act 3, the Israelites begin to understand God's heart more deeply, and although they don't realize it, they are getting ready for Act 4, which is the incarnation. When God becomes flesh and dwells among us, it's the plot twist to end all plot twists. Emmanuel, God with us. This is a pretty short act in the scheme of things. It's only about 33 years, the approximate time Jesus spent on earth as a living, breathing human being. And in this act, Jesus teaches and admonishes and suffers and dies and returns from the dead, all the while showing us the simple yet very, very complicated truth that God is love. But all too soon, it's over, and the disciples find themselves on a hilltop post-ascension, staring up into the empty sky, when some angels show up and begin gently mocking them. That is the humble beginning of Act 5. The new covenant. The church. I don't know if you're aware of the fact that new covenant is just another way of saying New Testament. That's what that means in your Bibles. So you have the old covenant and the new covenant. So here we are, the church. This is our act. We're in this play. And we find ourselves on stage without a script, improvising our lines. We know what has come before us. We have a vague sense of where things are going, but being in Act 5, on stage, improvising, requires us to think and even debate and change our minds as we try to figure out how to be the people of God in this new covenant. We are in what some scholars call an already but not yet situation. The new covenant has already come in Jesus. We are living in a new reality, and the resurrection signals the beginning of the end of the power of death, but we have not yet arrived at the fullness of that new covenant, when all shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. We know it's coming. We believe it's coming. We hope it's coming. We work toward it, anticipating the arrival of Act 6, the new creation. And we don't have a perfectly clear picture of this, obviously, but we get the sense that God will make this world right. Right makes it sound like the universe threw a flat tire and God shows up with a spare. It's not what I mean. I mean a complicated musical theme that is able to absorb all the dissonance we can throw at it and come out even more beautiful on the other side. The images in the book of Revelation seem to point this way. The city of God comes down to earth. God will dwell among the people. And creation will become, in a melancholy but beautiful and mysterious way, more fully and more deeply what it is called to be. Okay, so in all of that massive zooming out, I want you to notice where this morning's topic fits in. So that's the next slide, where covenant, different color. That's our topic this morning. Well, it's no wonder the Israelites saw the law as a gift, because it was part of the covenant. And the covenant was God's response to a genuine complication. I want you to remember the situation for the Israelites. Next slide. This was their situation. This is what they knew. And the covenant was the relationship that God initiated with them to make things better for them. That's the exegesis part this morning. What did the law and the covenant mean to them? It meant this. It meant a strange covenant from a loving God given as a gift so that they would have life. Our job then is not to zoom in too far and say, I just don't like that part about the terror and the wasting disease and the fever. It doesn't seem nice. That's not our job. Our job is to zoom out appropriately and in our imaginations, alongside the Israelites who are in this situation, see the covenant as a sign that God is irrationally in love with us and sets something up that is completely imbalanced in our favor. But we can also keep zooming out, and we can look at things from our place in history. So the last slide. And when we do, we see that as God has said all along, God wants to make things better for all people, which is what we see in the New Testament as they begin to explore what this new covenant means. And it means that all are invited to be part of this relationship with God. Okay, we can turn them off. The law and the prophets. That phrase has taken us many places these last 2 weeks. 7 days ago, we looked at the law, how it was so radically different from the normal ancient Near Eastern laws, and created a new worldview on this planet. We looked at what those sets of rules did for the Israelites and why they thought of the law as a gift. This morning, we zoomed out a bit and saw that the law is part of a bigger picture, it turns out. It's never on its own. It's always part of a covenant. And in this case, that's a relationship that was initiated by God for the benefit of, for the flourishing of the Israelites. They were at all times invited into this relationship and never forced into it. At no time does God hypnotize or coerce them, because God is stubbornly insistent on human freedom. I'm going to say that again. God is stubbornly insistent on human freedom. And if you don't believe me, just look around. Or look at all the times the disciples got it wrong. If there's ever a time you're in God's presence, it's being one of the 12 disciples. You're spending days and weeks and months and years with the Son of God, and you still don't get it. I think that is one of the most powerful signs that God insists on human freedom. The freedom to get it wrong. Then we kept zooming out some more, and we looked at the entire biblical story. And we saw that as God promised Abraham, the covenant was expanded to include the whole world. That's everyone. That's us. That's everyone that we don't think is us. So unlike that picture book, when we zoom out from the law and the covenant, we find a world surrounded by love, not emptiness. A world surrounded by delight, not darkness. We find a loving relationship that trumps all the rules. And we find that everyone is loved by God. That's the story. That's the big picture. The ancient Israelites got a taste of it. We get a slightly bigger taste of it. And there's even more to come. That's the promise, and that is very good news indeed. Amen.